Hey, what's going on everybody? It's ETAPRIME back here again, and today we're going to be taking a look at the brand new Super Console X2. So it's been a while since I've taken a look at these all-in-one little retro emulation consoles on the channel, and I believe the last one we took a look at was the X1 Pro, but they recently released the X2, and I wanted to see how it performed. The main draw for a lot of people with something like this is just the ease of use. Basically, you unbox it, you plug it in, and you can start playing within a few minutes. You don't have to do any kind of setup, you don't have to do any work. And there are people out there that want to get a hold of something like this. They don't want to have to mess around with the Raspberry Pi or another Android box. And this does come with two PS2 style controllers. I've used these in the past. They're not horrible, but you might want to upgrade down the road. I mean, this will definitely get you by. Not the best controller in the world, but I've never really had a big issue with them. It does use a 2.4 gigahertz dongle, and you need two AAA batteries to get it up and running. And of course, in this box, we get all of our other accessories, plus the Super Console X2. We've got our power supply, pretty extensive user manual, lots of documentation here. We also get a 6-foot HDMI cable and a remote, because this box also runs Android. So you could run Android if you want to, or you could plug in the micro SD card and run Emulation Station. They've also included a USB hub because the X2 only has two USB ports, and we actually have to use one of those for the micro SD card with Emulation Station on it. But finally here, we've got the Super Console X2, and right here is our USB to SD card reader. And this will allow us to run Emulation Station. We'll go ahead and get this plastic off. But yeah, I mean, it's not a bad looking box. Kind of wish it did have a micro SD card slot so we didn't have to take up one of those USB ports, but that's not the way this one's set up. Taking a look at the rear of the unit, we've got Ethernet, full-size HDMI, a 3.5mm audio jack, power in, and our power button. And over here on the right-hand side, we've got those two USB ports. So we've got full-size USBs on here. And that's about it for I/O on this unit. And when it comes to the specs for the CPU, we've got the S905X2. We've seen this in a lot of Android boxes over the past couple of years. This is a quad-core Cortex A53 CPU, up to 1.8 GHz. In some cases, I've seen these running at 2, but I believe we're at 1.8 with this. We've got the Mali G31 MP2 for the GPU here, 2 GB of DDR4 RAM. This will run Android 9 or EMU-elect from that micro SD card, and with EMU-elect, it supports up to 70 systems, and you can actually get up to 100,000 games right out of the box. Okay, so we'll go ahead and boot it up, and I am using one of the included controllers with that 2.4 GHz dongle. Like I mentioned, I've used these in the past. I mean, they're not super horrible controllers. They'll definitely get you started, but you might want to upgrade down the road. So obviously what we have here is Emulation Station, and it's running on that Amlogic S905X2. Not the most powerful unit, but I kind of wanted to check out some optimizations with the higher end stuff. Now, when it comes to the lower end games, you're going to be good. And as you can see, this thing has 107,000 games on it with their highest end model. Ridiculous, but I'm sure there are some doubles on here. And even though we've got that many games, it doesn't mean that every single one of them is going to run perfectly fine. But for the lower end stuff, NES, SNES, Neo Geo, PC Engine, MAME, CPS 1, 2, 3, Virtual Boy, Game Boy Advance, MSX, even Nintendo DS. This thing offers plenty of power for those systems, but yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of these are advertised as being able to play Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, and PSP. So really, that's what we're going to be testing out in this video. I do like the theme here. Very smooth, looks really good, and I really haven't had an issue with Emulation Station itself running on the S905. So the first thing I wanted to test out was a little bit of Sega Saturn, and of course we've got a lot of the Sega Saturn 2D games, which will run fine on the S905, but let's see what it does with a 3D game. We'll go with Panzer Dragoon. And a lot of these systems are set up with bezels, so it does make it look really good when it's running on a 16:9 screen, even though these are running at 4:3. As you can see, we've got that artwork for these games right on the side. Looks great, and if the artwork isn't available, it'll kind of just default to the platform bezel. And with this, the FPS was already turned on. You can go through the developer options and turn it on, but if you take a look in the top right-hand corner, we've got it listed there. With an NTSC version of this game, it would run at 60 FPS. That would be full speed on the original hardware. Or if we're talking about PAL or the European version, it would run at 50. And the FPS is up there. Give it a second to kind of stabilize, but it does feel a bit slow. and I was kind of afraid of this with the harder to emulate Sega Saturn games. But when it comes to the easier to emulate 2D games, which there were quite a few on Sega Saturn, it's going to run them at full speed. Real quick, I just wanted to show a lower end emulator running before we move up a bit. This is GBA, running really well, and the S905X2 has more than enough power for this one. Next on the list, PlayStation 1 with a harder one to emulate, Bloody Roar 2, and by the way, I did turn the music off in the game. It is there, I just disabled it because it is copywritten. But yeah, this is one of those that is hard to emulate, and we're at 60 FPS, so this thing really isn't going to have an issue doing PS1 games. Now, I did test out a few Dreamcast games, and I was quite surprised at how well it ran some of them. So you know, these 2D fighting games, which in my opinion the Dreamcast is known for, will run at full speed on this setup. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 here, fully playable. And along with this, there's a lot of other Dreamcast games that are going to run at full speed, just checking out this kind of performance. But as we know, there are easy and hard to emulate games, so let's go to Crazy Taxi 2. Again, this is one of those games that runs at 60 FPS, and we're getting really close here. And by the way, this is using the Flycast core inside of RetroArch. There are a few other settings that we could change, but you know, with the configuration they have, it does a good job with a lot of the stuff that's already on here. Unfortunately, there are some that are just a bit too hard to emulate. Moving over to some PSP emulation, we've got Street Supremacy, and I gotta say, this is a really great looking game for being a PSP game. We're only at 1x resolution, and I think this game would have been a bit more popular if it wasn't bogged down by menus. It's definitely fun to play, and here we are at full speed because this originally ran at 30 FPS. No frame skip is on right now. And I gotta say, I mean, it still looks good and plays just fine on this system. So again, when we're talking about these higher end emulators, yes, we've got a lot of games that are gonna run, but if you wanted to move over to something like God of War, either Chains of Olympus or Ghost of Sparta, the CPU and GPU combo here just really isn't pushing enough power. So here's Ghost of Sparta. We're at 1x resolution with frame skip turned on. And usually this game runs at 60 with frame skip turned to 1. This should be running at about 30 FPS, kind of half speeds it. But with the way this is set up right now, it's not even quite running at half speed, so I've just turned frame skip completely off just to show you what it can do. And like this, with no frame skip, we can only hit around 21 FPS with this game. And this is kind of the case across the board with these CPUs. It's not just this little box here, it's the S905X2. So I've actually been a big fan of using these little Android boxes as an emulation setup, and especially right now, given that the Raspberry Pi 4 is so hard to get, when you do find them, people are scalping them. And the S905X2 does offer better performance on the GPU and CPU side of things when you compare it to the Broadcom CPU and the Pi 4, but like I mentioned at the beginning, I think the best thing about these little setups is just the ease of use. You pull it out of the box, you plug it in, and you start playing. A lot of people just don't want to mess around with downloading different images and things like that. And I completely understand because sometimes it can be a bit tedious. So if you're looking for something that's plug and play that'll let you do thousands and thousands of retro games, then this might be a good option for you. But keep in mind, even though you can pick these up with a ton of games, not every single game is going to be fully playable, and it just really comes down to the hardware used. But for the easier to emulate PSP games, Dreamcast, and even Sega Saturn, that's about as high as we're going to be able to go with this. If you wanted to do NES, PC Engine, FBA, Neo Geo, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation 1, even N64, then you'll be good to go with a little setup like this. But I mean, in the end, it's really up to you. Really appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, or if you want to see anything else running on the Super Console X2, just let me know in the comments below. And like always, thanks for watching.